Dr. Dennis Halft. He is a specialist in Islamic, Iranian, and comparative religious studies as well as Christian theology. He currently holds a postdoctoral fellowship focusing on interreligious polemical writings of Jewish and Christian converts to Islam at the Center for the Study of Conversion and Interreligious Encounters in Lund University in Beersheba. Please.
Yeah, thank you very much. So first of all, I would like to thank Dr. Kiel for his fascinating presentation. And it is indeed very impressive to see how you analyze and compare the underlying legal principles, not just of one, but of three different religious traditions that are so interconnected. So the main focus of your presentation was what you call the jurisprudential turn. That is to say, the process of legal canonization of central religious works, during which a community establishes and fixes its relationship to normative texts in general. So the intersection of such legal and theological processes of canonization were, as suggested by Dr. Kiel, comparable in the Jewish, Islamic, and Zoroastrian traditions in the 9th and 10th centuries. As I'm neither an expert in the history of law and jurisprudence nor in Zoroastrianism, I will limit my comments to a theological debate within the Muslim tradition, which can also be described as a sort of jurisprudential term that I would suggest. So adding on to Dr. Kiel's remarks on the process of legal canonization in Sunni Islam, I would like to draw your attention to Shi'ism, and in particular to an inner Twelvite Shiite debate on the legal and theological status of the hadith of the Imams. So not of the Prophet Muhammad, but of the Imams. So at the center of the debate between the so-called Akhbari scholars and the Usuli scholars in Iran of the 17th century was the following question. What is the authority of the saints and the actions of the Imams as a legal source, and what is the relation of the hadith of the Imams to the Quran and, of course, the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad? On the one hand, the Shiite scholar Muhammad Amin Astorabadi, who died 1626, and is often described as the founder of the Akhbari movement, he argued that the reports, the akhbar, attributed to the Imams were the only legitimate legal source. So the akhbar provide sufficient legal guidance for the whole Shiite community in the interpretation of other sources, including the Quran. So accordingly, the Quran and the Sunnah should be interpreted through the prism of the interpretation of the Imams. And this binding interpretation of the Imams should be accessible, according to Muhammad Astorabadi, through the so-called 4 books. And the 4 books are, in Shiite Islam, 4 hadith collections, normative hadith collections, compiled by Al-Kulaini, Ibn Babawai, and Sheikh Atusi. And they are considered as the authentic and reliable corpus of the hadith. So Astorabadi argues that the authors of the 4 collections had screened the akhbar before including them in their collections, since they claim themselves that they have only integrated those akhbar which are in fact reliable reports of the Imams. So the argument is that individual hadiths are authentic because these books in which they are included are reliable as a whole. So according to Astorabadi, there is no need for isnad criticism as we know it from Usuli scholars and Sunni Islam, of course, because it's not relevant to identify authentic hadiths of the Imams. Since Shia authors admit the general possibility of dissimulation, taqiyya, of course very famous in Shiism, which means in fact that an imam issued a report under dissimulation for fear that revealing the truth, the true ruling, would undermine the security of the whole Shiite community. Historical accuracy in the isnad is of little use actually for legal matters. So in other words, a report issued by an imam and transmitted to the hadith collectors can be legally irrelevant due to dissimulation, although historically true, so to say. So to give an example of an exegetical practice, to reach a legal ruling in the Akhbari tradition is what I want to highlight through two writings by Muhammad Amin Ostorabadi. So in the early 1620s, when Shah Abbas the Great, Shah Abbas I, was the ruler of the Safavid Empire, he consulted Ostorabadi whether or not wine is to be considered a pure substance or an impure substance. So Ostorabadi issued a fatwa on this topic, of which the only known manuscript is preserved in the Malik Library in Tehran. In 2007, Robert Gleave edited the fatwa in the appendix of his monograph, Scripturalist Islam. And in this fatwa, Ostorabadi argues, based on the reports of the imams, in favor of the cultic purity of wine. And a few years later, in 1624, when Ostorabadi stayed in Mecca, he composed an entire treatise on the topic entitled The Purity of Wine. And in this treatise, he actually amplified his legal opinion in favor of the purity of wine. So Ostorabadi specifies in this kind of an anecdote in his treatise that in fact he issued his earlier fatwa at the request of Shah Abbas, because Shah Abbas had been drinking alcohol from an early age, so he had some interest in the purity of wine, so to say. So this unpublished treatise of Ostorabadi is extant in two manuscripts, which are held by the Central Library of the University of Tehran and the Ayatollah Marashi Library in Rome. No wonder Ostorabadi's purity of wine provoked several refutations by Usuli scholars, and among them was also the prominent author Sayyid Ahmad Alavi. He's a student of the well-known Shiite scholars Sheikh Bahai and the philosopher Mir Damad. So in his treatise in favor of the cultic purity of wine, Ostorabadi makes use of a far-reaching legal principle, which is of interest, I think, to our discussion. So those reports of the imams, which agree with the hadith of the Sunnis, should be understood as issued under dissimulation. So they are not regarded as legally relevant. Only those reports which contradict the hadith of the Sunnis are seen as reliable to discern God's law and to reach a legal ruling. So Ostorabadi's logic is clear. Since the reports of the imams, which claim that wine was impure, agree with the Sunnis, they are assumed to have been issued under dissimulation. Ostorabadi, therefore, by doing this, marked a clear Akhbari identity in contrast to Usuli scholars and, of course, Sunni opinion. So in support of his argument, Ostorabadi quotes various reports attributed to the sixth Imam, Ja'far as-Sadiq, and based on Sheikh Tusi's collections of hadith. The line of argument in these reports is similar. The companion of the Imam asks Ja'far as-Sadiq whether one can pray in clothing that has come into contact with wine, and the Imam's answer is that, I quote, "There was no problem, for clothing cannot intoxicate," end of quote. So wine was only forbidden to drink, but it was not considered an impure substance as such. So this is quite revolutionary in legal thinking in the context of Shiism. So Astorabadi thus concludes on the basis of these hadiths that one can pray wearing a piece of clothing upon which wine has been spilled. So this was the legal, the issue of the legal discussion. So now it becomes clear from Astorabadi's argument on the example of the purity of wine that he gave to the reports of the Imams a central role in the exegesis of the law. He argued for the reliability of the akhbar as historical records of the words of the Imams and, of course, as indicators for legal rulings. So, as it is known, the Quran expresses a largely ambivalent attitude towards wine as an intoxicating beverage, and it is identified as a source of sin and idol, and assuming that God, like in the process of the Quranic release of the Quran, the surahs finally prohibited wine. So therefore we find a strict prohibition of wine in both Sunni and Shia schools of law. However, Akhbari scholars have a different hermeneutical approach, giving the words of the Imams the priority even in interpreting the Quran. In other words, Quranic verses cannot be understood independently from the reports of the Imams. So following the Imams is the principal method to generate legal rulings. So to conclude for our topic, I think that this Akhbari discussion of the ritual purity of wine speaks to the intersection between theology and law. So while the four Shia Hadith collections were important to both Akhbari and Usuli scholars, Astorabadi's prioritizing of the reports of the Imams as the legal source shows the impact of a changing theological interpretation on jurisprudence and law. So I would suggest that the revival of the Akhbari movement in 17th century Iran can also be seen as a kind of jurisprudential turn within Twelver Shia thought. Since the corpus of sacred texts for Twelver Shiites was fixed, but giving them a different meaning, a different theological interpretation, resulted in fact in generating a different and partly even opposite legal ruling. And this, as I said, even within the same branch of Shiism. So this shows, of course, the complexity of legal culture in Shiism and in Twelver Shiism in particular. So while the canonization of normative religious texts had come to an end, the relationship of the Twelver Shia community to these texts was actually fluid and highly depending on a constantly changing theological context. Yeah, and I think this aspect could also enrich our discussion of the influence between theology and law. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our second respondent is Dr. Karen